Hey, everybody. We're about to start. Hey. I want to welcome you all here today to the Heled Travel Grant presentations. We have two really great presentations forthcoming from Drew Basile and Sof Sears. I want to take a moment right off the bat to thank Molly Heled Kimberg for her generous donation for the Terry B. Heled Travel Grant and Travel and Research Grant. That's the fund that makes all of this possible, and it makes it possible each year for students to travel the world, write about it, and kind of choose your own adventure. I'm not the person that runs the program. I do have information about it. So if you have questions, I can answer them or direct you to Mingo Reynolds, who will definitely be able to answer them. I do want to say that the deadline for this year is March 19th at midnight. And all students can apply, including seniors, if you are committed to coming back to do a presentation in the following year. But that said, I want to start actually with Drew Basile to talk about his travels through Italy. So come on up.
All right. The height is always weird here. Thank you, RJ, for the introduction. Maybe I'll just hold it. Oh, maybe I won't. A huge thank you again, though, to Molly Heled Kinberg for sponsoring this grant. I know I really appreciate it. Soph really appreciates it, as well as Mingo Reynolds, who is not here today. You know, the organizer, pulling the strings, putting this all together. So really appreciate it from both of you. I was lucky enough to use this money to go to Italy to retrace Goethe's Italian journey. Now, a little clarification on what the Terry B. Heled Grant is it is it's set up for Penn students who have a creative project, some artistic adventure they want to go on. It requires international travel. This is like a travel grant to allow that to happen. So I went to Italy. Let's talk about it. Goethe, this guy, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, he's very regal. This is in his later years. He's kind of the pillar of the German literary tradition. So the way that we have Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is like the foundation of English letters, and he's what you read and like the fine points of mastery. Similarly, Goethe is that for German, but Goethe was exceptional because he was a polymath. In addition to being, a world famous writer even today, he was a philosopher, he was a scientist, he was a botanist. When you think of the color wheel, the first person to really lay that out was Goethe. So you probably have used his ideas in a lot of lesser capacities that you maybe didn't know about. But Goethe's route through life, not just through Italy, he was the son of a civil servant. He wanted to be a lawyer. He failed. He was a bad lawyer, so he was like, I'll be a writer instead. Usually it goes the other way. He wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, which was a novella. On the date, 1774. Basically, the gist with Sorrows of Young Werther is that it catapulted him to success because it was about this young man who was very moody and brooding and in love, and things didn't work out so well, and he ended up, dying. And all the German guys, the Romantics, loved this, and they started dressing like Werther, and Goethe was a huge success, and he didn't really like any of this. So he decided, I'm going to leave Germany, I'm going to abscond for 2 years of secrecy, and I'm going to go to Italy. And by going to Italy, he was participating in something called the Grand Tour. Now, back in the day, if you wanted to be an artist, it was difficult because we couldn't all just go and Google all the paintings or take the train to the Met in New York and go see them. So enterprising people like Goethe, they would go to Italy for a year or 2 years, and they would study all the Renaissance, masterworks. They would study like the Hellenic architecture and the sculpture from Rome and antiquity and all of that. And then you would come back with this fully fledged knowledge, and you would be able then to write things like that. Goethe was not alone in doing this. His father had also done it and published a travel log, which was moderately well received, wasn't really remembered. And so he was following up on that. And his son, interestingly, would replicate Goethe's journey in his 30s, and his son was an alcoholic and would actually die in Rome. So Goethe was very disheartened to hear that. Anyways, this is Goethe's route. It took 2 years. He started up here. He went down through the Tyrolean Alps. He saw northern Italy briefly. He spent a lot of time in Rome. Then he went down to Sicily. After he finished in Sicily, he went back to Rome. He lived there for a year and a half, about a year, fell in love, and went to Venice for a little bit longer. That part is not documented, so we don't really know what happened there. But there's an unusual feature of this map, which is that he went to Sicily, and it was very uncommon to go to Sicily at that time, the end of the 18th century. Sicily was like a lawless place of bandits and nomads, and there was no infrastructure at all there. I mean, it was really disconnected from like European society. It was kind of like a black hole. Nobody knew what happened there. And Goethe was in Rome, and typically Naples, which is about an hour and a half south of Rome, was the end of your Italian journey, your grand tour. And he met this German painter named Haeckel, which is a funny name, but he basically said that Goethe had it in him to head to Sicily. And Sicily was kind of a mythic place, and so Goethe's idea in going there was he was searching for something called my German's not very good, but the Urpflanze, which is the herb plant. And it was a common idea in science at the time and in botany that all of life originated from like a single organism. And if you could find that organism, it would be like the key to unlock all of the development and evolution of life, not just to this point, but in the future. Like the idea would be that the code would be there for future generations of evolution. And Sicily for Goethe represented not just that, but even actually a cultural seed, because here was, the foundation of like the Greek, the Greek Empire. That sounds a little odd. We think of Greeks as being Athens, but in fact, two of the three largest Greek city-states and trading nations were Agrigento and Syracuse, which are both in Sicily. And so it was kind of an archaeological trip in that he was rediscovering these bases of culture and biology and the high stakes. We'll see if it panned out for him. Now, Drew, I did not quite have as lofty aspirations, but I did want to go and follow Goethe's route and retrace it. I did it in reverse, for exigent reasons, which is that it's very hot in Sicily, and so I wanted to go as early as possible to beat the heat. So a slight compromise, but I went to Palermo, Agrigento, Ragusa, Syracuse, Catania, Taormina, Cefalu, and Enna. Some of those are new. Goethe did not set foot in Cefalu or Enna, for example. They weren't really so prominent back in his day. Then I migrated north. I went to Rome. I lived there for a month. Naples, Florence, Bologna, Parma, Venice. I had big plans after Venice, of course, but I did get COVID, and so then I kind of just hung out at the beach, and I decided like this is a good place to stop. And then up to Munich to go home. So the idea behind this was that the Grand Tour is no longer really, it's an artifact of the past. The people don't really do it anymore. But I thought there was a lot to learn, and I was interested particularly how these Grand Tour routes had shaped like Italy today. We all, for spring break or whatever, I mean, not all of us, but some of us probably, go off to Italy or for the summer, and you see the sights, and you see, Venice and St. Mark's, and you go see the Vatican and Rome. But like, why are these important tourist sites? They're important tourist sites because all these artists and cultural figures have visited them for centuries and have kind of codified them as that route. But what that route was, was very indeterminate for a long time. So that was one of my motivations in going and producing kind of a travel log that would document this. So I'll give you a couple examples that will hopefully be fun, interesting things that Goethe saw, that I saw, that people don't usually see. So this is what's called Villa Pelagonia. It's in a small town called Bagheria, which is outside Palermo. A good example of kind of the mission of my trip is that Bagheria is really like a small town, and it's dusty, and there's not much going on. Sicily doesn't have much economic activity in a lot of it. So I get there, I get off at the wrong train station, so I'm on the outskirts, and my phone dies. So I'm totally lost. And moreover, it's like 2 PM. So the afternoons are a time of rest in Italy. They're all asleep. So there's nobody out on the streets. I have no one to ask. And I'm wandering around trying to find this place where I'm going. I've journeyed out to get there, and I see a street called like Via Goethe, so like Goethe Road, basically. And I lack of better options, I just start following the street, and the street, leads directly to here. So there was an example, quite literally, where Goethe's route had been like inscribed in Italy today, and I was lost, and just by like, sticking to what I'd read, was able to figure out where I was going. So kind of a nice example. But anyways, Villa Pelagonia was exceptional in its time because, one of the preeminent kind of like mansions estates that was built in Sicily. It was built by a noble family. Here you can see the ballroom, very Rococo style. They were all trying to imitate what was going on in France. what's exceptional about it is all of these grotesque sculptures. So it was built by the Gravano family. You know, the grandfather's like the heir. He makes all their money. He sets it up. The grandson is a little bit decadent, and he decides that he's going to decorate the whole mansion with these statues, and they're all hideous grotesques of like elves and imps and things like that. And it was very unusual because each of them is hand carved. This was a massive project. It was unheard of, certainly in Sicily and Italy, but even really in like France or Germany. And it was a source of inspiration for like the surrealists, a lot of Italian media films there because it's so strange. And Goethe went and was flabbergasted by it all. One interesting story is I went there and there were people at the gift store who sell the tickets and they run the museum. And I was asking them questions about it in my halting Italian. And they told me that it was sold to the Castronovo family in 1850. So the Gravanos, they spent all their money on statues and they had to sell it. And I was like, well, what happened to the Castronovos? And there's like an old woman there and a middle-aged man. And the old woman says in like real deep dialect, I was like, do they still live here? Do they still own it? And the woman, loudly begins to proclaim that she is the Castronovo and like they are this noble family which has been reduced in circumstance a little bit and now runs the museum. Like what was formerly their villa, they've now turned into a museum and they live at the bottom floor. And so the guy who was selling the tickets, he doesn't think I understand. So he's like, ignore her, but I did. So that was kind of an interesting discovery. And if you go there, that'll be a secret, I guess. Here's a little farther along in the journey. This is Taormina, famous amphitheater, probably the best preserved. You can see in the distance a lot of smoke. That's Mount Etna. So I think largest active volcano in Europe. This was one of those beautiful places I went. I also had the good fortune of climbing up Mount Etna later on. Goethe did this. It was very uncommon to do at the time. He had to really look for days to find somebody to bring him up to the top because at that time the volcano was active and so there was a shroud of dust and fire and they actually thought the dragons lived up at the top so nobody wanted to take it. But he found two local guys to hike up with him and they hiked up just about to the mouth of the volcano and it was active and so it begins to like belch out smoke and rock and it shoots pumice into the air. And this is enough for them, and they all like run down the mountain, terrified. And that was the end of the climb of Mount Etna. But they still got pretty far. I mean, it was very unusual for somebody, either Italian or foreign, to climb the mountain like that at that time. Okay, so this is a little later. Does not look much like Italy. It looks like a British pub, and it is. I had finished with Sicily, and I was in this town called Enna, which is inland, and largest inland town, but not a ton going on there. And I was walking around and I came to this like bar or club and it was full of like young people and they were all hanging out and they had spilled onto the sidewalk and there was this esplanade and it looked down over a cliff that dipped into this almost like Martian arid burnt valley that went on for miles with hills and like these village tops and it was very beautiful. And I was like, darn, I wish I had like Italian friends and I could like hang out at the bar and like look at this, I'm kind of lonely for the first time. So then I moved to Rome. And this was the bar right next to where I was living. It was called the Clifton, named after a bar where Edward VII would have dalliances and things like that. But while here, I actually managed to befriend like a whole cadre of like young Italian guys. It was a very interesting set. One of them was like the youth judo champion. Another was like a philosophy student. One was like in med school. Another ran like a car dealership. They had pictures with like Maneskin, who was apparently like from the area. So it was a very interesting, and they all took me home to like meet their parents and things like that. So that was odd. I told them that I was there on like a writing trip, that I was sponsored to write. I think they perhaps overestimated my importance, and so they really like took me around and showed me around. They were like, oh, we have a beach house in Naples we're going. You can come to that. And I was like, that's okay. But I mean, that was a wonderful, great time, and it really helped me get kind of the local experience. Which is what I was trying to replicate because while Goethe was there in Rome, he similarly had that experience. He lived there on the left. Today it's a museum, Casa di Goethe. It's all redone. The only thing that remains is the same as the ceilings. The ceilings, Goethe would have looked at those, so some solace. But he befriended a whole group of German and English painters while he was there in Rome. Tischbein, probably the most well-known today of his entourage, painted this interesting portrait of Goethe. But I mean, already this has been romanticized by kind of the view of Italy that he went in and they promulgated, and that I was trying to uncover. So, like, this is a totally fictitious landscape. It's along the Appian Way. Goethe is this didn't look like him at all. They were really into physiognomy at the time, so they would always paint his face to, bring out certain qualities. And as a result, it doesn't look like anything like Goethe. Every portrait of him looks different. If you compare this one to the first one, you'll notice very little similarity. These ruins are interposed because the idea was that Italy is this place of, where the past is still salient, things like that. So anyways, I wanted to just settle in. And the last kind of exciting story I'll tell of my adventure, and hopefully, inspire you or fire you to go out and apply for the Terry B. Heled grant yourselves. Seniors are able to. I see some juniors in the crowd, is Bologna. I was in Bologna. It's a university town. It's host of probably the best university in Italy, although there's some debate. And I was there with a friend of mine named Ludwig, who was from Sweden and who I had met earlier on. And we decided to travel together. And this is the center square of Bologna, and because it's kind of an erudite town, in the summer they play movies. And so the 2 days I was there, the first movie they played was Notting Hill, which was great. I'm a big fan of Notting Hill. The end always it gets me. But the second movie they played was called Wings of Desires, which is an unusual movie by Wim Wenders. It's about angels who fly through Berlin, and they have like little interventions and save people, and sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. And one of the angels falls in love with a human, with a circus performer. And he decides that he's going to give up his wings. He's going to give up being an angel to go down and be in love with her and all that, what was involved in that. And so we're in this massive square. There's probably 1,000 people at least. And it's a clear, dark night. And just as he gives up his wings and he falls down from the heavens, this ethereal scene, and there's helicopters and all kinds of stuff in the movie. This large gust of wind comes right down through there. I was right there sitting there. And it pulls up all the umbrellas in the square, and they all fly around in the air, and all the glasses fall off the table and shatter. And so here's this amazing moment where this movie is being projected against the church, and it's dark, and there are angels flying around basically onto the sky, and then all the umbrellas are picked up in the wind, and what an incredible experience. And so we can't all replicate Goethe's trip. He was arrested as a spy. He was involved almost in a shipwreck. I can skip some of those details, but. It was nice to be able to replicate the journey and not just have the tourist experience, but have some exciting and original moments to write about in my project myself. Okay, there's the speech. Thank you guys.
And come on up, Sof, to talk about your travels this summer.
Do I need to do anything? Oh, okay. Yay. Great. Like 5 people who are here. Okay. Yeah, so I will talk about my project now. So I went to Paris, which was an interesting experience, I will say. I went for a month, and it was definitely a different experience than I had hoped for, and that was primarily because of the heat, because it was one of the hottest summers in Europe on record, and there's basically no air conditioning in Paris, and I also have chronic illness, so it was just not a great that experience. The physical limitations were, changed the experience quite a bit, but I still had a very interesting time. Thanks. Yeah, so basically my idea came primarily from this ongoing obsession I have with death care and death work, and specifically the study of death itself, the thanatology. I kind of wanted to find a way to explore that, but not like it's been an ongoing, I guess, interest of mine for a long time, and I've never wanted to like go to mortuary school or something quite that, I guess, like professional, but I wanted to explore it. And I think the great thing about the grant is that there's not a lot of courses at Penn that allow you to think about death this way. There's not a lot of like death studies courses, which there should be, but it kind of enabled me to focus on this maybe more peculiar or like harder to access interest from a creative standpoint. And I think that the grant kind of enables like kind of these interdisciplinary, weirder, more speculative projects that you might think there's no like outlet for. I think that it is like a perfect way to explore all those things. So the picture I have here is the Père Lachaise, my French is terrible, FYI, Père Lachaise Cemetery, which is one of the most famous ones in Paris. And this is also a picture beneath it of, I think it's during the Civil War in the United States. And essentially the connection that I'm trying to make here is how women are primarily like have always been the ones who are doing death care and death work in the home, in every space. And in the Civil War particularly, like this is just an interesting example of how basically like there were these at-home funerals, like funerals were still in the home, and women were always the ones tending to the soldiers and doing what they could within the home. And this is before like the professionalization of death, like as an industry, and the funeral industry, which I'm like very critical of. And so, yeah, I think that these were kind of the fragments that I wanted to find a way to tether together. And Paris is like a very uniquely interesting place to do this. Yeah, so part of it is because I'm pretty familiar with Paris already, but I really wanted to return and think specifically about this. I took a gap year before college and I went to Paris for a while, and it was a very weird experience. It was wonderful, but it was like I only spoke a little bit of French and there was a lot of hostility and I was kind of just trying to make do on like a very small budget. But it was overall like, obviously like it cracked a lot of the kind of ideas I had about Paris, but it also drew me back and made me want to return. And specifically, I was really fascinated by how death functions in terms of the city. The city has like a very weird relationship to its dead. So essentially, after doing a lot of research and reading, it's basically like the way that Paris has handled its dead and thinks about its dead has transformed like very visibly. Like it's pretty easy to mark when certain transformations are made. And I think that like explicitness is not usually found. Like usually you have to do a lot more digging in history, I think, to note where these changes happen. But Paris specifically has like pretty clear, I would say, like markers of, okay, death becomes like this public thing and then it becomes this private thing and then it becomes public again. And so, for example, there used to be public, like death as a form of entertainment was very big. Basically, like in I think the early 19th century, there were these like morgues that you could go. They're basically like public morgue viewings open to anyone. And people would go there with their pals and like go look at like dead people. And like the more gruesome and horrific the death, like the more people would show up because they would advertise it like a cool little hangout. Yeah, and so I was like, okay, this is an interesting thing, public spectacle, like, it's a weird space, but also, I think that the thing that I felt most potently and that I wanted to explore in the project is how there are these kind of radical moments that also happen within this relationship to death, because I think Paris has a relationship to death, which I don't think a lot of cities, or I don't think the United States as a whole, I think it's a pretty like death averse, death anxious country. And kind of the way that capitalism functions in terms of death is like to basically shove it off to the side and bury it and make all the actual processes of death and dying and the like utmost inevitability of it, push it off to the side and make you pay like gazillions of dollars for a funeral. And so I think it's really refreshing to be able to have this kind of really robust history of a city actually like different, I guess, people actually considering and reflecting on the relationship to death, and especially thinking about it in relation to public space. So this is why I chose Paris. Yes. So once I got there, I was definitely like, okay, it's very hot and I do not feel good most of the time. And it was just like a little bit of immediately like all of the kind of plans that I'd made kind of collapsed a little bit. So I had to improvise quite a bit. And I think I always reflect on this when I'm like traveling alone, but traveling alone as like a femme person is always also just an endangering act, and it might sound dramatic, but I think, you're constantly kind of reminded of that. There's these constant like perforations of any of your curiosity and your ability to explore. And I think that also kind of played into what I wanted to write about and think about as well, because that came up a lot. So because it was so hot, originally I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like chill in all the cemeteries and go to the National Archives and try to interview people. But it was also extremely touristy at the same time. So it was like the cemeteries were really overfilled whenever I was there. The tours that I went on were not, I don't know, it was just like a weird period of time to be there. So I decided to focus on the catacombs because it's underground and it's nice and damp and cool down there. And I'm not going to say that I did something illegal, but I I went on some unsanctioned explorations of the catacombs, the parts that are not technically open to the public. I was like, I'm subverting public space. Like, yeah. Basically, long story short, because I've lived in Paris before, I do have some friends there. And so one of the things that I never gotten to explore, but was very interested in originally, was this kind of underground, like literally underground subculture of cataphiles, which I'm like, it's kind of a weird name. But basically they're these people who like host raves and movie screenings and parties and dinners and all types of things, like Rocky Horror, for example, down in the catacombs, in the illegal parts of the catacombs. And also they're just like urban explorers who are trying to chart and map the catacombs, because there's not like one, it's like an endless place. The actual mapped part is very small. Like no one knows just how deep it goes, how wide it is. So it's very mysterious in that way. And just some quick, I guess, history of it is that the reason that the catacombs exist is they used to be like mine tunnels. That's what they were originally for. But basically in, I think, the early 18th century, France, or Paris specifically, basically started running out of room for its dead for a whole different myriad of reasons. And like bodies were piling up and leaking into the street, and like all these did not smell good, and there was like rotting human beings everywhere. And so people were getting really sick. Obviously public health was not great at the time, no sanitation. And prior to that also, it's interesting because death was kind of, that's like also a shift that happened where they wanted death to be like, or your relationship to the dead to be more of a public, communal, like reflective experience. So cemeteries originally were like more so outside of the city in the suburbs, but increasingly they started being like centralized in the city because the like municipal kind of, I don't think, like they wanted to basically take control of death, which was kind of oriented. The purpose of that was to expose people to it and give people an opportunity, like these kind of beautiful, lush green spaces, and make the cemetery not like a hostile, threatening, scary place, but more of a reflective place. But of course, like because of bad government and like very ill-advised policies and overcrowding, that quickly like devolved into all of these cemeteries being like extremely overcrowded. So basically they needed somewhere to put all of these bodies. And so a lot of these bodies were already like basically not buried. They were just kind of piled in cemeteries. But they also they like exhumed like millions of bodies, and in the dead of night, because they didn't want anyone to like see this happening and get freaked out, they relocated the bodies to these mines, because they're like, we don't know where else to put these people, like we're just gonna put them down there, I guess. So it's kind of a haphazard ordeal, but it is interesting, I think, because especially during the French Revolution, a lot of the distinctions that still kind of, I guess, structured cemeteries and spaces of death kind of started to dissolve, because like during the Terror specifically, like a lot of like revolutionaries were thrown into the catacombs. And so they are merging with like common people. Like there's no way to distinguish between who's who. And so in that way, like this place becomes kind of an equalizing space for the dead, which didn't like really exist beforehand. And so it's also a very cool space, because I found out that Oscar Wilde used to party down there and hold dance macabres down there, which I'm like, that's awesome. But also, something that I was thinking about a lot was how even in this space, and this is kind of the contradiction I think that feels like it kind of structures Paris for me, is that there's a lot of potential for these radical subversive spaces, but there are also still, even in these public spaces, like there's still these power imbalances, and there's still a lack of safety for certain people. It's like utterly dependent on who you are and your access to power. And also, on the other hand, it's like getting increasingly policed. So part of the risk of going down into the catacombs is that, like in the illegal sections, is that police like are very aware of what's going on, and so they will close off, like seal off entrances, but you might already be down there. So many people have died down there because they'll, open a sewer or something, like go through some random route, and the police will seal it off, and so they won't have a way out. So there's just a lot of things happening. It was also used, weirdly enough, as I learned, as a cruising space for queer men, the catacombs, like for quite a while. And especially in I think the 1920s is, so I think that there's also this kind of subversion, as were cemeteries. So there's just a lot of different things happening here, obviously. So basically, the most exciting part, I guess, of my journey in Paris was, and the scariest part, and like in retrospect, maybe not quite responsible of me, was to follow this man down into the catacombs. He was not like a total rando. Like I knew him somewhat. My friend, who is from Paris, like basically knew him because she's been to a bunch of these raves and stuff down there. So it was like word of mouth. It was still a little sketchy, but basically I met him in this corner of the city in this arrondissement like that I'd never been to, and he had like a headlamp and he had gloves and like all these different materials for me, and basically popped open like sewer like a pothole in the middle of the sidewalk. And this isn't my picture because he was like, you cannot take pictures because it's he was scared I was gonna like expose him. I think he thought I was a cop, I don't know, but but basically like that's equivalent to the tunnel that I went down, and I'm a very claustrophobic person, so this was not the most fun experience. We didn't go that deep because I was like, I'm not going on a crazy like we're not traversing the entirety of the catacombs here. But we went down there and we spent like 5 hours down there and going through it. But it was like, well, because it's like a long thing, like, but he knew everything about the route. He knew all of the history of it. He was showing me like, there was graffiti everywhere. There was like a free library. There was there were all these remnants of people who have been down there. So it wasn't like, I don't know, it was a well-worn space. And so it was just a crazy experience to go down there and to kind of see this part of the catacombs that was closed off. And I think part of that too makes you think a lot about like how public space is being increasingly policed here, and for what reasons are not exactly clear, because there hasn't been like a state attempt to actually kind of map the full extent of the catacombs. And obviously, so now it's like it's dangerous because we don't know the entire landscape down there. But yeah, there's just this interesting community of people who are like totally willing to basically risk their lives and go down there constantly and try to map it out, which obviously you can kind of reflect on, is that a good idea? Is it worth it? But they are very insistent on the fact that they're doing something, if not radical, then like somewhat subversive to public space. And but at the same time, then you think, okay, who is this exactly safe for though? And who has access to this? Who can just go down, a pothole in the middle of the street and be okay? So yeah, this was probably the height of my experience in Paris. And I think that overall though, like it kind of enabled me to think about death culture, like the way that cities interact with their dead and the way that people conceptualize the dead and the ways that people might try to negotiate their fear of death, and utilize like public spaces as celebratory spaces, as queer spaces. And there's obviously a lot of danger embedded in that, but also there's a lot of kind of interesting potential, I think, for freeness and creativity. So overall, it was like, I would say it was a very, not always pleasant, but it was like a very generative experience for me, and thinking about that and writing about that. Yeah, so obviously it was, a lot happened, but that was kind of my journey overall. Okay.
All right, y'all. Well, thank you again for coming, and for everybody watching at home. Again, I can answer some very general questions, but please feel free to reach out to Mingo Reynolds if you have specific programmatic questions. I do know, again, that the deadline is midnight on March 19th. So if you're interested and excited by this, please, please, please apply. Thanks again.